If someone had told me a year ago that my daughter would ban me from her wedding, I would have laughed in their face. But here I am, sitting on my couch, staring at an email that confirms just that. My daughter, Sophie, 28 years old, sharp as a whip and stubborn as a mule, has blocked me from her wedding. Let that sink in. I'm the guy paying for this shindig, and I'm not even invited. I never thought we'd end up here. Sure, Sophie and I have had our share of ups and downs over the years, but what parent and child haven't? I thought I'd done my best. I wasn't perfect, but I tried to be there for her, to guide her, to love her. Apparently, that wasn't enough. It all started when Sophie announced her engagement to Jake. I wasn't thrilled about Jake at first. He seemed a little too laid back for someone marrying my fiercely independent daughter, but I kept my opinions to myself. Sophie loved him, and that was enough for me. When they started planning the wedding, I stepped in to help financially. Weddings are expensive, and I wanted to make sure Sophie and Jake could have their dream day without the stress of mounting bills. I offered to pay for the venue, the catering, the whole deal. Sophie seemed grateful at first, but then things started to shift. As the planning got underway, Sophie became more distant. She assured me everything was under control, so I didn't pry. I trusted her. But one day, I thought it would be nice to add a personal touch to the event, inviting my younger brother, Rob. Rob and Sophie had always been close, so I figured it wouldn't be an issue. That's when the alarm bells started ringing. I called Sophie's wedding planner to ask if we could add Rob to the guest list. The planner hesitated, awkwardly, like he was trying to figure out how to break bad news. Finally, after a lot of hemming and hawing, he dropped the bombshell. The guest list was finalized, and it didn't include me. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a mix-up. How could I, the father of the bride, not be on the guest list for a wedding I was paying for? I asked the planner to double-check, but his answer didn't change. Sophie specifically instructed us not to invite you, he said, and there's additional security arranged to make sure uninvited guests don't enter. Security. To keep me out of my own daughter's wedding, I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I asked the planner to forward me the emails Sophie had sent him, and when I opened them, there it was, in black and white. Sophie had gone out of her way to exclude me and my wife, Rachel, from her big day. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was deliberate. Sophie had planned every detail to ensure that I wouldn't be there. I felt blindsided, betrayed, and deeply hurt. I tried to call Sophie to confront her, but she didn't answer. I left her a voicemail asking, begging, for an explanation. Days passed and there was no response. My mind raced with questions. What had I done to deserve this? Was it something I said? Something I didn't do? I replayed every disagreement we'd ever had, searching for a clue. Eventually, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I got in my car and drove to Sophie's apartment. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I needed answers. When Sophie opened the door, her expression was unreadable. Calm, almost cold. "What do you want, Dad?" she asked, like I was a stranger showing up unannounced. I told her the truth. "I want to know why my name isn't on the guest list. Why am I not invited to your wedding?" Her response was like a dagger to the heart. "Because you don't belong there," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "I thought it would be easier if you just didn't come." Easier? For whom? I felt my chest tighten with anger and sadness. I tried to reason with her, to remind her of everything I'd done for her. But Sophie wasn't interested in listening. She rattled off a list of grievances, how I'd never taken her side, how I'd abandoned her emotionally when I remarried after her mom passed, how I'd failed her in ways I didn't even realize. I tried to explain, to apologize, to make her see that I'd always loved her, even when I didn't always agree with her choices. But Sophie didn't want reconciliation. She wanted me to leave. "Just stay out of my life," she said, shutting the door in my face. I drove home in a daze, trying to process everything. Sophie had made it clear she didn't want me at her wedding, or in her life for that matter. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that my heart was broken. After Sophie shut that door in my face, I sat in my car, for what felt like hours. My mind was a mess, bouncing between anger, sadness, and disbelief. My own daughter, the kid I'd raised, supported, and loved, had looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in her life. The drive home was a blur. I barely remember the streets or the stoplights. All I know is that by the time I got there, my wife Rachel was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face filled with worry. Rachel's always been the calm one between us. When I told her everything that had happened, she listened without interrupting, her hands clasped around her coffee mug. When I finally finished, she set the mug down, looked me in the eye, and said, "You know you can't keep letting her treat you like this, right?" I nodded, but I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could just snap my fingers and make Sophie care. This wasn't some petty argument we could sweep under the rug. This was years of resentment coming to a head, and I wasn't sure if I even knew how to fix it. Rachel, as always, had a way of cutting through my spiraling thoughts. "You're paying for this wedding," she said, her tone firm, "and she's treating you like you're nobody. If she doesn't respect you enough to invite you, then maybe it's time to stop funding her disrespect." Her words hit me hard, but she wasn't wrong. I'd spent so much of my life trying to make Sophie happy, bending over backward to avoid conflict, but where had it gotten me? Excluded from her wedding and treated like an afterthought. The next day, I sat down and thought long and hard about my next move. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about respect. I'd been footing the bill for everything, the venue, the catering, the decorations, all of it. And now I wasn't even allowed to attend? No. I couldn't keep enabling this behavior. I called the wedding venue and asked to speak with the manager. He sounded surprised when I told him I wanted to cancel everything. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "The wedding's just a couple of weeks away." "I'm sure," I replied. "Send me the cancellation confirmation as soon as possible." The manager tried to talk me out of it, bringing up deposits and contracts, but I didn't care about the money. I'd already decided that I was done being Sophie's doormat. The cancellation would be my way of drawing a line in the sand. After I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief because I was finally standing up for myself, but guilt because I knew this would send Sophie into a tailspin. Still, what choice did I have? I couldn't keep letting her walk all over me. When the confirmation email came through, I showed it to Rachel. She nodded approvingly, her hand resting on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said softly. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me still felt like a terrible father. No parent wants to hurt their child, even when that child has hurt them first. The fallout was immediate. The wedding planner called me in a panic the next morning, saying they couldn't access the venue to start setting up. When I explained that I'd canceled the reservation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Does Sophie know about this?" he finally asked. "She'll figure it out," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Sure enough, Sophie figured it out. By the afternoon, my phone was blowing up with calls and messages from her. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for another shouting match, and honestly, I didn't owe her an explanation. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Later that day, Rachel and I heard a loud banging on the gate outside our house. Sophie was there, yelling for me to come out. I stood at the window, watching her pace back and forth, her face red with anger. Rachel reached for my arm, her eyes full of concern. "Don't go out there," she whispered. "She's just going to lash out." And lash out she did. When I didn't respond, Sophie started shouting insults, accusing me of being selfish and cruel. "You ruined everything," she screamed. "You've always been about yourself, Dad. You don't care about me. You never did." Her words cut deep. But I didn't move. I couldn't. This wasn't a conversation. It was a hurricane, and stepping into it would only make things worse. Eventually, Sophie gave up and stormed off. I watched her car speed away, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I didn't regret canceling the venue, but the weight of what had just happened was almost too much to bear. That night, Rachel and I talked for hours. She reminded me that I wasn't a bad father for setting boundaries, that Sophie's actions were her own, and that I couldn't keep taking the blame for her choices. I wanted to believe her, but the guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. By the time I went to bed, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was about years of unresolved anger and pain, and it wasn't going to be fixed overnight, if it was going to be fixed at all. The day after Sophie's meltdown at our gate, the phone calls started coming in, not from her this time, but from family. Somehow, word had spread about what had happened, and suddenly I was fielding calls from relatives who had no business getting involved. "You canceled the wedding?" My mother's voice was tight with disbelief. "Jack, that's your daughter's big day. How could you do that?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mom, she didn't even want me there. She hired security to keep me out. What was I supposed to do? Keep funding a party where I'm not welcome?" "But you're her father," she argued. "You're supposed to rise above it no matter what. She's still your child." That was the theme of the day, relatives scolding me for taking a stand, telling me I should have let Sophie have her day and dealt with the aftermath later. None of them seemed to understand how deep the hurt ran, how many years of tension and resentment had led us to this point. My father was the only one who offered a different perspective. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly when we spoke on the phone. "I know it's not easy, but sometimes kids have to learn the hard way. She can't keep treating people like this and expecting to get away with it." Those words stayed with me. They didn't erase the guilt, but they gave me a little comfort, like maybe I wasn't the villain everyone was making me out to be. That week, Sophie's fiancé, Jake, called me out of the blue. His voice was tense, almost pleading. "Mr. Allen, I don't know what's going on between you and Sophie, but this wedding is falling apart. She's not handling it well." I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tightening. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I can't keep funding a wedding when I'm not even invited." "I get it," he said quickly. "I do, but Sophie's spiraling. She's angry all the time, yelling at everyone, blaming me, blaming you, blaming the world. I don't know what to do anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with frustration and exhaustion. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for him. Jake wasn't the bad guy here. He was caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than him. "Jake," I said finally, "I don't know what to tell you. I've tried to talk to Sophie, but she won't listen. She's made it clear how she feels about me. I don't know how to fix this." He sighed, the sound raw and defeated. "I don't think anyone does." By the end of that call, I felt more conflicted than ever. Jake was trying, that much was clear, but Sophie's anger wasn't something he or anyone else could fix overnight. A few days later, Rachel came into the living room, her phone in hand. "You need to see this," she said, handing it to me. It was a photo of Sophie standing outside the wedding venue, her face red with anger, surrounded by confused guests and bewildered vendors. The caption, courtesy of some distant relative, read, "The Allen family drama strikes again." I handed the phone back, my stomach twisting. "Great," I muttered. "Now the whole world knows." Rachel sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee. "Jack, you can't control what people say. You did what you had to do. Let them talk." I nodded, but her words didn't do much to ease the knot in my chest. I hated that this was what it had come to, a public spectacle, a family divided, and a daughter who saw me as the enemy. The next time I heard from Sophie was a week later. She didn't call. She showed up at our house again, this time calmer but no less determined. Rachel was out running errands, so it was just the two of us. I opened the door, unsure of what to expect. "Sophie?" I said cautiously. "What are you doing here?" She didn't waste time. "I need to know why you canceled the wedding," she said, her voice cold and direct. "Was it to punish me? To embarrass me?" I stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "It wasn't about punishing you," I said as we walked into the living room. "It was about respect, or the lack of it." "You didn't want me there, Sophie. You made that painfully clear. How could I keep paying for something I wasn't even a part of?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "You could have talked to me first." "I tried," I countered. "I called. I came to your apartment. You shut me out, Sophie. You didn't give me a choice." Her eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it, I saw something else. Hurt, maybe even regret. For a moment, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken truths. "You think I don't respect you?" she said finally, her voice trembling. "But you don't respect me either. You never have." Her words hit me like a freight train. "That's not true," I said quickly. "I've always respected you, Sophie. I've always loved you. But respect goes both ways." She looked away, her shoulders slumping. "You don't get it," she murmured. "You've never gotten it." I wanted to argue, to demand she explain what she meant, but something in her tone stopped me. This wasn't a fight I could win. This was a wound too deep for quick fixes. After a long silence, she stood up. "I shouldn't have come," she said, her voice flat. "This was a mistake!" "Sophie, wait," I said, reaching out as she headed for the door. "We can talk about this. We can—" But she was already gone, the door slamming shut behind her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been. I didn't know if we'd ever be able to fix this, but one thing was clear. Sophie wasn't ready to let go of her anger, and I didn't know if I had the strength to keep trying. After Sophie stormed out of my house that day, I sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing down on me. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out what I could have said differently, but no matter how much I turned it over, I kept hitting the same wall. Sophie didn't want to hear me. She didn't want to fix things. She wanted someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. Rachel came home a little while later, bags of groceries in hand. She took one look at my face and set the bags down on the counter. "She came by, didn't she?" she asked. I nodded. "We talked, if you can call it that." It was more like, she talked, and I got hit with all the reasons I'm apparently the worst father in the world. Rachel sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "What did she say?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "She said I don't respect her. That I never have. I don't even know where she gets that idea. I've always tried to support her, to give her what she needed, but somehow that's not enough." Rachel didn't say anything for a while. She just listened, her presence steady and grounding. Finally, she said, "You can't make her see what she doesn't want to see, Jack. You can only do so much. The rest is up to her." Her words made sense, but they didn't make it any easier. I wanted to fix things. I wanted to go back to when Sophie and I could at least talk without everything turning into a fight. But it felt like that ship had sailed, and I didn't know how to bring it back. A few days later, I got a call from an unknown number. When I picked up, the voice on the other end surprised me. "Mr. Allen, it's Jake." I sat up straighter. "Jake? What's going on?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I think we need to talk. In person. Are you free tonight?" I glanced at the clock. "Yeah, I can meet." "What's this about?" "I'll explain when I see you," he said, his tone heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Can we meet at Mason's Diner around 7? "Sure," I said, still trying to gauge what this was about. "I'll see you there." When I arrived at the diner, Jake was already there, nursing a cup of coffee and looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. As I sat down across from him, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slump in his shoulders. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice low. "Of course," I replied. "What's going on?" Jake took a deep breath, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I don't know how to say this, but Sophie and I aren't together anymore. We've separated." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. "Separated? What happened?" He hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Sophie, she has a lot of anger. And it's not just directed at you. It's everyone, me, her coworkers, and even random strangers sometimes. She lashes out, throws things, says things that are cruel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." He shook his head. "I don't think anyone did. She hides it well, but behind closed doors, it's a lot." I tried to be patient, to help her work through it, but it got to a point where I couldn't anymore. I had to leave for my own sanity. I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. And she blames me for all of this, doesn't she? Jake looked down at his coffee. She blames everyone but herself. But, Mr. Allen, I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here because I need your help. My help? I asked, surprised. She needs therapy, he said firmly. She needs someone to guide her, to help her work through all this anger she's carrying. She won't listen to me anymore, but maybe she'll listen to you. You're her father. I let out a bitter laugh. You think she'll listen to me? She won't even let me in the same room without a fight. Jake sighed. I know it's a long shot, but I don't know who else to turn to. She's pushing everyone away, and I'm worried about what'll happen if no one steps in. I sat there for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over me. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell Jake that Sophie was no longer my responsibility, but another part, the part that still saw her as my little girl, knew I couldn't just walk away. I'll try, I said finally, but I can't make any promises. Jake nodded, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. That's all I can ask. The next day, I showed up at Sophie's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say or how she would react, but I knew I had to try. For her, for both of us. When she opened the door, her expression hardened immediately. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I want to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly. "Make it quick." I stepped inside, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "Sophie," I began, "I know things between us aren't great right now, but I'm worried about you. Jake told me what's been going on and—" "Jake?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "So now you're taking his side too? Figures." "It's not about sides," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's about getting you the help you need. I'm not here to judge you. I just want to see you happy." Her laugh was bitter, almost mocking. "Happy? You think I'll be happy if I just sit in some therapist's office and spill my guts? You don't know anything about me, Dad." Her words stung, but I pressed on. "I know you're hurting, Sophie, and I know you don't want to hear this, but therapy could help. It could help you work through everything you're carrying." She glared at me, her eyes blazing with anger. "Get out," she said through gritted teeth. "I don't need your advice and I don't need your help." I stood there for a moment, hoping she'd change her mind, but it was clear she wasn't ready to hear me. With a heavy heart, I turned and walked out the door. As I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made things worse. But deep down, I knew I had to try. Because no matter how much she pushed me away, Sophie was still my daughter, and I wasn't ready to give up on her just yet. I didn't expect to hear from Sophie after our last conversation. She was angry, defensive, and drowning in her own pain. So when a week passed with no word from her, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, though, was the call I got from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Lily, Sophie's childhood best friend. "Mr. Allen, it's Lily," she said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "I heard from my mom about what's been happening with Sophie. I'm so sorry you're going through this." "Thanks, Lily," I said, taken aback by her call. "It's been a lot." "I wanted to help," she said. "Sophie and I haven't spoken much in the last few years, but we were close once. If she'll talk to anyone, it might be me." Hope flickered in my chest. "Do you think you can reach her?" "I can try," she said. "No promises, but if I can convince her to talk or even consider therapy, I'll let you know." "Thank you, Lily," I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "You have no idea how much this means to me." True to her word, Lily reached out to Sophie. Over the next couple of weeks, she kept me updated, though progress was slow. Sophie was guarded, angry, and resistant to opening up. But Lily was persistent, and eventually Sophie agreed to see a therapist. When Lily told me the news, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Sophie was finally taking a step toward healing. Sadness because I knew I couldn't be the one to guide her there. Months passed, and I heard little from Sophie. The silence was difficult, but I knew pushing her would only drive her further away. Then one day, out of the blue, my mother called to tell me Sophie had visited her. "She apologized," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "She said she'd been carrying so much anger for so long and she didn't know how to let it go. Jack, I think she's trying to change." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "That's good to hear," I said, my voice cracking. "Did she say anything about me?" "She did," my mother admitted. "She's still upset with you, Jack. She's not ready to forgive you yet, but she told me she understands why you did what you did. She's starting to see things more clearly. It wasn't the reconciliation I'd hoped for, but it was a start." As Sophie continued her therapy, small signs of progress began to show. She reconnected with a few old friends, including Lily, and even reached out to Rachel to offer a tentative olive branch. It wasn't much, just a brief text thanking Rachel for putting up with her, as Sophie put it, but it was more than I'd expected. For me, though, Sophie's silence remained. I respected her need for space, but the distance between us still hurt. I couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever let me back into her life. Then one day, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Sophie. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. The letter was short, but every word hit me like a tidal wave. "Dad, I'm still angry. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry, but I've started to understand where some of that anger comes from, and it's not all your fault. I've been carrying things I didn't know how to carry, and I took a lot of it out on you. That doesn't mean I'm ready to forgive you, but it does mean I'm starting to see things differently. I don't know if we'll ever be close again, but I thought you should know that I'm trying. And maybe someday I'll be ready to talk. Sophie." I read the letter 3 times, my heart aching with a mix of hope and heartbreak. It wasn't a declaration of love or an invitation to rebuild our relationship, but it was something, a crack in the wall she'd built between us, a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. Months turned into a year, and Sophie and I remained distant but civil. She continued therapy and even started working on mending some of her relationships. I didn't push for more. I knew better than to rush the fragile progress we'd made. One day, as I sat on the porch with Rachel, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace. Things with Sophie weren't perfect. They might never be, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in fragments, in small, quiet moments of progress. And sometimes, that's enough.